Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Amma ba'd. So, today's video is going to be sort of like a deconstruction of what is usually posed as an alternative to creationism, and that is the theory that the hypothesis that the universe has always existed, the universe has always been in existence, and I'm going to demonstrate how. Inshallah, I'm going to demonstrate how this does not make sense logically. And well, we know that anybody who's aware of the philosophy of science and the scientific method should be aware that in order for any scientific sort of theory to be valid, it needs to fall into the ambit of logic. And if any sort of scientific if anything that emerges from the scientific method goes against logic, then it obviously isn't plausible. And logic and the presumption that human beings are capable of logic and rationally following through from one premise to another, this is one of the presumptions of science. So obviously we can establish from this fact, this presumption, that I believe to be true, and so do the scientists and the atheists, the presumption that a human being is rational. So with this presumption, we obviously have to dictate the scientific our scientific discourses with the presumption that logic is superior to science in when it comes to discovering truth. So inshallah, I'm going to demonstrate how the concept of the hypothesis of an eternal universe fails logically. So first we need to know what the implication of an eternal universe is, and like it obviously follows through that if the universe is eternal, then events that happen in time stretch back into infinity. They go infinitely. Like, time is essentially has no beginning. That's what an eternal universe implies. And if time has no beginning, then the events that happen throughout the timeline, throughout that infinity long timeline, are also infinite. What do I mean by an event? For example, something as trivial as the snapping of my finger. This counts as an event in the timeline of the universe, and so does me picking up this book, or me, dropping something on the floor. You get my point. Anything that happens counts as an event in the universe. Even me speaking, every syllable that I'm uttering is an event in the timeline of the universe. So basically, how the huge logical fallacy of an eternal universe is that it obviously, if you logically follow through the steps of this hypothesis, that A, the universe has always been in existence, and B, therefore time is infinite. It stretches back into infinity. It has no beginning. B and C is, if time is infinite, then the events that happen throughout the course of that timeline are also infinite. That much is clear. I hope I'm making sense. So how is this logically implausible? Well, Imam al-Ghazali, a famous Muslim scholar from the golden age of Islam, he deconstructed this very beautifully, which was sort of, this view was gaining rapidly and dangerously throughout the Muslim ummah by some people known as the not the Mutazilites. It was a famous scholar from that region. His name was Ibn Sina. He was greatly influenced by the teachings of Aristotle and the notion that the universe has always been in existence. So Imam al-Ghazali, he saw this worldview for what it was, and how dangerous its implications were, and how illogical its implications were. So he deconstructed this in the following way. He said that we obviously, and I'm paraphrasing obviously, so he said that basically we obviously can't reach back into infinity and see and go infinitely back into the timeline. We obviously can't do that because time, according to this hypothesis, is stretching back into infinity. But what we can try to do, is retrace our steps back gradually. So, but that would obviously present another hurdle, and this is where the issue lies. This is the core issue of this hypothesis, and that is that we can neither retrace our steps back, and nor can we go back into infinity and retrace the events that happen in this eternal universe. How is that? How does that undermine this theory, logically speaking, and thereby render it to be scientifically inaccurate and not a plausible worldview that can lead you to truth? That is the reason for that is, look. Sorry, I got interrupted, but yeah. So here is how this worldview does not make sense logically. Imagine every event in the timeline of the universe to be represented as a domino. I hope you know what a domino is. And as we know from our worldly observation, for the last domino to fall, it has to be preceded by the previous domino falling, and then it has to be preceded by the previous domino falling, and so on until the beginning domino flips and then causes all the other in the line to fall. Now, keeping this analogy in mind, picture the events in the infinitely long timeline of the universe as pieces of single dominoes. So right now I'm speaking this. The present is me uttering these words, and the immediate present event is this. So this event, me snapping my fingers. Let's just pause the timeline there for a minute, okay? And obviously, we know that I really snapped my fingers, and in order for that to happen, the previous event needed to transpire, and so did the previous event, and so did the previous event. And imagine these events as dominoes. So what I said earlier, that in order for the last domino to fall, the previous one has to fall, and so does the previous one, and so does the previous one, all the way back to the beginning. So the reality of the present undermines the hypothesis of an eternal universe, because we know that the present happens. We know that presently we are contributing to the totality of events that happen into the timeline of the universe. Me, smacking this cupboard, it is happening. Me picking up this book, me speaking, these things are happening, and these things are happening because something transpired before them, and something transpired before them not infinitely, but through a really long timeline. When we retrace our steps, imagine if somehow we were given the power to retrace every event in the universe back. Eventually we would be led to the first domino, from where the events of the universe started to transpire, and thereby so did the ones that followed through. If the universe is eternal, then the events would be infinite in the universe, and that is simply not true, because we know that the present is happening. If the events stretched back into infinity, then for the present to transpire, for me to snap my fingers, there would have to be an infinite number of events that needed to transpire for the present to take place. I hope I'm making sense. Just it's staring us right in the face that we know that the present exists, and the present exists because the past is infinite. Yeah, that's Imam al-Ghazali's entire argument summed up. That the mere fact, and this is kind of like, it took me a while to wrap my head around this, but think about it. If the present exists, that does mean that past events transpired and they followed through to the present. If the past events reached back into infinity, then we would never arrive at the present, because the past events were infinite, and we know that infinity is never really actualized. It is sure, you could represent it in mathematical language and imaginary, and you could study into it in the imaginary branch of mathematics, but in the real world, infinity is never really actualized. So an infinite number of events would never, ever transpire for the present to take place. And we know that the present is happening. We know that the present is true and it exists. And time is actually moving forward, which means that the events prior to the current events are not infinite. And that really collapses this eternal universe theory flat onto its face. What does that leave us with? If the universe is eternal, it does have a beginning. And if it does have a beginning, the universe, then time has a beginning. And if time has a beginning, then time, the concept of time, the time is itself a creation because it is bound by a beginning and an end. So, you really need to think about what created time and how did time come into being, and if the universe is eternal, then it must have had a beginning, and how did that come to be? Assalamu alaikum.